Hey, I want to welcome you guys to this night. Christ, the wisdom of God, psychology at the intersection of science and religious faith. Before I pray for us, I want to introduce you to someone who is no stranger to us at Bellwether, Dr. Andrew Majors. He's been a part of our church for the last few years, maybe. He graduated from Mississippi College before pursuing his doctorate in psychology from Wheaton College. And then he returned to Mississippi just 2 years ago to open the Renewal Health Group in Madison, a holistic outpatient mental health clinic. He and his wife, Holly, have 3 children, Robin, Wesley, and Cole, that you can see running around here on Sunday mornings grabbing cookies. Before I pray, I was telling him I have some expectations, okay, for tonight. And I shouldn't have said expectations. I anticipate these things because I've been around Andrew enough. I ran into Austin Fortenberry on the way here and stopped, and I was like, it's going to be at least these 3 things, okay? Number 1, it's going to be humorous because if psychology doesn't work out, Andrew has a future in stand-up comedy, okay? It's going to be intellectually stimulating because every time you get to have a longer conversation with Andrew, he's an intellect. He reads and listens well, and he's always learning, and that's a blessing to people to be around. And then third, I believe it'll be spiritually edifying for us just to hear from him and hear how he thinks about his practice and how he thinks about his particular expertise and vocation, which is a gift to so many people. And I think we have so many people in the mental health profession in our church. So anytime we get to consider, what is this? How should we be doing this? How can we consider these things? It's helpful. And so would you guys join me in praying for Andrew and our time together, that it would be those things, that we'd be able to enjoy this time? All right, would you bow with me? Lord, thank you so much for the people gathered in this room, those who know you and maybe those who do not. I pray that we would know you more completely as we consider all that Andrew has prepared for us tonight. I pray that you give him peace, that he'd feel at ease with us, and that you would use him as a vessel to instruct and to correct, maybe, to comfort us who are here to receive. And I pray that you'd give us the right posture just to ask, how would you instruct us, Lord, tonight? I pray that we would enjoy the receiving of this as a gift. And I pray these things for the sake of your name, Jesus. Amen. Please welcome Andrew.
In? Okay, awesome. Thank you. I'm humbled to be here tonight speaking to all of you. One point of order. We'll talk for maybe 25, 30 minutes and then take a break so people can go to the bathroom, get a second cookie. I can put a cough drop in my mouth, and then we'll come back about 5 minutes later. Mom's got a bunch, so we're ready. And then we'll come back and finish, and then do a Q&A time at the end for anybody that's got any questions. So, about a couple of stories, I guess, to get started. About 5-6 years ago, around the time of COVID, I woke up one day to my shock, I guess I would say, to find that my profession mattered all of a sudden. COVID had swept in this wave of normalcy for psychology, and everyone seemed to be asking me about my opinion on the Enneagram or the Myers-Briggs, and the conversation really had changed a bit in the therapy office. You know, it went from, hear me out, when your house got hit by a tornado when you were a kid, maybe that has something to do with your panic attacks when it rains. Just hear me out, just maybe. Right now, the conversation is, okay, listen, telling your barista about your identity disorder is probably not doing for you what you think it's doing. So we've moved from this place of repression almost to exhibitionism about psychological matters. And so tonight I want to try to speak to that cultural conversation and try and discuss, what does psychology have for us? Does it have anything for the followers of Jesus? And perhaps if we're lucky, someone within earshot may be curious of matters of belief, anything valuable to say about psychological science and what makes a person tick. So I hope we're tonight to offer some guidance on these things and how to approach these matters, what it looks like to be in this ditch, to be in that ditch, how to stay in the middle of the road. So the program I went to for grad school was an integrated program, which means that we were being trained how to hold special revelation, like the scriptures, and general revelation, science, these two textbooks in our hands at the same time. And so that might have come a little bit more naturally for me. I grew up in a family that both my parents are faithful believers and scientists, and so we were always trying to hold these two textbooks at the same time. In fact, I learned a little bit late, I think, compared to the next person, that could even be a problem, or that might be even a little confusing to the next person. I have this distinct memory of, it was 7th grade, and this guy named Ben said, "We didn't come from no monkeys," with a lot of venom, and that was a new thought for me. And so I went home, and Dad and I, this is a true story, Dad and I are raking the yard, and I said, "Hey, Dad, this kid at school, said we didn't come from monkeys." And Dad's like, "That's ridiculous. Of course we didn't come from monkeys. We came from apes." And so now we could take a deep breath. Evolution is not on the docket tonight, okay? But we will be focusing on science, religious faith, and how psychology might be at the intersection of those two camps. So, as one last point of order, whenever I'm trying to reason through a topic, I tend to start at the philosophical and the historical, and then try to move to the boots on the ground practical stuff. So if philosophy and history isn't your thing, Nancy made a lot of cookies, so grab an extra one, and we'll get to the boots on the ground stuff eventually. So, all right, let's light this candle. So, I have cotton mouth, and so I'm going to drink some of this, and then I'm going to talk. All right. Dr. Gould had really poked the bear. It was in 1997 that the esteemed Harvard professor and evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould meant to provide a helpful roadmap for how to address the combination or the integration of science and religion. In his essay, Non-Overlapping Magisteria, quoting the compelling Pope John Paul II, Gould argued that science was meant to answer the questions of how the world works, whereas religion is meant to answer the questions of why are we here and how should we live. And I value the good doctor's desire to make peace between two often conflicting camps, particularly as this essay was written during the rising heights of the so-named New Atheism in Western society. In 2006, Richard Dawkins released his infamous The God Delusion, and only a year later, Christopher Hitchens published his seminal work, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Society. Or poisons everything. Actually, it was worse than that. Some present may not be as familiar with the high-profile debates of the 20-aughts when the question of God's actual existence was more at the forefront of the American mind than maybe it is today. These men were branded by some as two of the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse, as they argued vehemently to place religion and faith at odds with science and religion. Despite this, or science and reason, despite this, many thinkers and writers, believing, agnostic, and atheist, were then and still are attempting to philosophically reconcile the relationship between science and religion. Here, I want to make two brief kind of contextual references for our later conversation. So the first is the philosophical perspective known as Epicureanism. Yep, awesome, thank you. Hugh is on it. Which stretches back to the Greek philosopher Epicurus, who lived some 300 years before Christ walked among us. As a rough outline, Epicurus taught that there are no gods, or if there are, they're a long way off and have little to nothing to do with our kind of goings-on here in daily life. And what Epicurus was also teaching was that everything really was sort of based on atomic fluctuations. That's what produced new life, that we were all of life was comprised of these atoms and something he also called void. And that ultimately when we died, that those atoms sort of dissolved into nothingness. And so what that left people with was they kind of got off the hook for how they lived their life, because your atoms were going to dissolve, so you didn't need to really worry about all this fussy afterlife stuff about where you're going to go, good or bad. So the second observation that I need to make is that the Christian church has been grappling with the debate about science and religious faith for millennia. In 415 AD, St. Augustine, in his book, The Literal Interpretation of Genesis, warned of Christians who might damage the credibility of our faith because they refuse to have a healthy respect for natural philosophy. Much later, when the towering Thomas Aquinas penned his unfinished magnum opus, Summa Theologica, in the 2060s and 70s, he was attempting to reconcile the brilliance of natural philosophers like Aristotle with theological revelation. His conclusions and his rhetoric, and later his sainthood, canonized reason as God's gift to every man. Many people then, and still do, saw that these magisteria, natural philosophy and theology, to be at odds. And Aquinas, he didn't put this debate to bed. Dante, less than 100 years later, when he's writing his Divine Comedy, he places Virgil, Homer, Plato, Socrates at the highest level of hell in limbo because of their noble lives, yet they still were in hell because they didn't know Christ. Fast forward another 300 years, and we get the combative Galileo, who was famously placed under house arrest by an equally obstinate church authority, eventually dying there in 1642 because he had the audacity to say that the earth revolved around the sun. Soon after came the Enlightenment and the heyday of rationalism, the oversteps of Enlightenment thought, and you can hear it in the name, we are now the enlightened ones, gave birth, amongst many things, to a resurgence of Epicureanism. As N.T. Wright explains, Enlightenment popular culture seized on scientific discoveries about how the earth works to show that, clearly, nothing can be the result of divine intervention. In other words, you start with a wrong idea of how heaven and earth might work, namely that God reaches in, does some things, and then goes away again, and you demonstrate that we can't see that process empirically, and therefore God can't be involved at all. If you begin with a false picture, then disprove that image, it's all too easy to imagine you've disproved the real one. Next came the devastation and disillusionment of 2 world wars, birthing the traumatic reaction of the postmodern era, which railed against objective reality. The 20th century was the bloodiest in history, with an estimated 1 to 200 million deaths. Some 60 million people died at the hands of the atheistic communist and Soviet, Russian, and Chinese governments. Apiece. Subjective moral reasoning clearly has its faults. Fast forward to 2026, and our pluralistic society now seems to struggle to have any cohesive sense of identity, morals, meaning, or goals. For example, many of the patients I treat now will unblinkingly tell me that life has no meaning without any sort of awareness of the anxiety that should produce, as if they're telling me about their coffee order. So, all right, now that you're all encouraged, I can end my... No? Okay. No, the point of my brief cherry-picked history lesson is to highlight the drastic turns that Western thought has had in relation to this ancient debate. We at times have held faith superior to natural philosophy, such as in the time of Dante, and at times like today, we have held that natural philosophy is superior to faith as a means of answering life's most important questions. And I also feel the need to reemphasize some of the consequences that can occur when either of these perspectives is held without respect. So when religion dominates natural philosophy, people can be imprisoned and killed for saying otherwise. But when natural philosophy dominates religion, life can erode into meaninglessness and genocide. But to return to Gould's logic, if how the world works is the question science posits to answer, and if how we are to live and why are we here are the mysteries religion attempts to solve, what are we doing exactly when we are attempting to measure the efficacy of one way of living versus another? Or how would you classify the study of what results from one answer to the meaning of life versus another answer? I'm persuaded to say that these questions can't be so conveniently separated. In fact, I would argue that you cannot answer one without answering the other. For example, just 10 years ago, the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, declared addiction, like alcoholism, to be a chronic disease, not a moral failing. But is it that simple? An overcorrection from one ditch is just the other ditch, right? So it is a disease, but it also has a moral component and a relational component. How so? Well, research shows us that more than anything else, groups of meaningful relationships with other people who are struggling lead to wins in dealing with compulsive addictive behavior, right? So this is why AA is so effective and similar treatments like it. So if the problem was purely organic and merely a chronic disease, then relationships would have no play in the matter, right? But shame, which cannot form or heal without relationships, is clearly a part of the equation. So this point of intersection regarding meaning-making, shame, and behavior is what I would classify as psychology. In its broadest sense, psychology is the science of human behavior. More specifically, it is the cause and effect analysis of human thoughts, feelings, and actions. However, in spite of those sterile definitions, most people are not content merely with a neutral or simple calculus of what makes people tick. Most of us want to know what makes us tick in the right direction, right? And what makes us tick in the wrong direction. So in fact, that ubiquitous need that we all seem to have to weigh good versus bad underpins, if not defines, what makes Westerners so fixated on societal progress. Tom Holland, the brilliant English historian, makes this argument quite convincingly in his book Dominion, observing that the Western obsession with progress is in part a direct descendant of Christian teaching. So what happens is we've got this uniquely Jewish idea that there's one true faith, and then the Christians, we pick that up and we go, yes, there is one true faith, and that one true faith is actually available to everyone. And then we're also preaching that this one true faith is sort of wrapped up in this idea of salvation for mankind. And so then we've got the Epicurean thought, right, that life is generated by atomic movement, that all life is sort of based on this atomic fluctuations. And so at the Enlightenment thinkers pick up these two philosophies, and there's this unholy union that happens. And they say that atomic scientific thought will alone save mankind. That then develops into this disagreeing with science is effective to unbelief in the one means to salvation, which then leads to this new atheism idea that any new atheism critiques Christianity as foolishness by using Christian truth claims. Does that kind of make sense as it flows together? Yeah. So Enlightenment teachers took the singularly Christocentric idea that there really was only one true faith for all of mankind and combined it with the Epicurean notion that the world and life should be explained through an atomic perspective. In the post-Enlightenment era, the gospel of Western scientific thought and its ability to save humanity, ushering in wave after wave of progress, became the increasingly popular religion and worldview, so much so that the two guys I was talking about earlier, Hitchens and Dawkins, cannot critique Christianity without using the very missional vocation which Christianity first began and made so salient. Indeed, those who identify themselves as anti-religious and progressive have inherited that salvific hunger from the teachings of Jesus, even if they look for it in a different person, ideology, or place. So again, how are we to classify the study of psychopathology, which translates literally into the study of the suffering of the soul? Is it scientific work or something else? Is it religious? I hope to explain tonight why I believe the answer to this question is yes. In fact, I wish to argue that scientific work and theological work, when done rightly, are leading us in the same direction, towards new creation. And likewise, while the field of psychology, at least with respect to the question, what is the best way to live, can be a helpful point of intersection between these overlapping magisteria. Okay, so where to begin? We haven't begun yet. Yeah. So firstly, we will benefit from being introduced to a framework for understanding the basic positions one might take in this debate. I'm partial to the excellent guidance of John Hott of Georgetown University, who proposes three perspectives. Excellent. Yeah, conflict position, contrast, and convergence. So conflict, you can really take as an atheist or as a Christian. Basically, it says that these two things are at odds with each other, that they can't agree, and that you need to choose one or the other. The contrast position is the one that Gould and many others have taken. It basically says, hey, these two camps, these two worlds are asking fundamentally different questions. They're trying to help in different ways. We can coexist like the bumper sticker. We can all get along, right? And then convergence says, hey, no, they're not just they're not enemies. They're not just sort of like apartment mates. They're actually brothers. They're complementing each other. They're informing one another, and they each have space to learn from one another. So, brothers, not enemies. So, I want to strongman each of these positions and argue for them in the most charitable light I can so that we might understand each of their merits. Okay, so the Christian who takes the conflict position, firstly, rightly understands and holds that the scientific discovery, though useful in many respects, isn't necessary towards salvation and entering into God's rescue project of creation. People were following Jesus' footsteps for some 1,600 years before the scientific method formally existed. Thank you very much. So, though scientific discovery may be quite useful for many conveniences and improvements in life, it isn't necessary for the things that matter the most. And to that, I would wholeheartedly agree. Secondly, the conflict position, again, states that science and religious faith have nothing in common, and thus are opposed to one another in their approaches, the questions they ask, and their goals. And so if this is true, the faithful believer is faced with some obvious challenges. The first is what we might call the argument of competing cosmologies. If science means to explain our reality in principle through physical atomic means, then appeals to God become explanatorily redundant. Thus, a Christian would rightly wish to circle the wagons, as it were, and argue that science has no right to comment on one's purpose, morality, or their experience of God. These apparent conflicting claims as to the origins and inner workings of the universe simply won't align if we hold that the scientist must make the prior assumption that there is no God, because he or she seeks only to make sense of the universe through the observation of physical matter. It's at this point of the conflict that you often hear the term the God of the gaps, which is the idea that the more we understand about how the universe works scientifically, from neurotransmitters to geological records to the movement of the stars, the less we need a God to fill in the gaps of our lack of understanding. So again, I agree that if I am made to choose between a universe with a personal, intelligent beginner, or instead resolve myself to being meaningless dust that somehow manifested from nothing, then yeah, I'm going to agree with the former. Secondly, in 97, Nobel laureate and declared atheist Steven Weinberg famously wrote, "The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless." I can easily approve of the Christian taking the conflict position when considering the curious trend of some atheistic scientists having turned from systematic observers of matter to evangelists of nihilism. Nihilism is the philosophical perspective that life is meaningless. One finds it rather confusing, for example, to hear the British professor and outspoken atheist Susan Blackmore try and cope with a tragic story of multiple avoidable deaths by telling herself, "Buck up, Susie, nothing matters." Blackmore seems to miss the apparent irony that she finds great purpose in teaching her students that life has no purpose. Nihilism can leave the Christian in the difficult position of trying to argue for meaning in a world of immense suffering, which is a task no less enviable for an agnostic or an atheist, by the way. But how quick the wagging finger of the atheist is to highlight how pointless life is. Countless species exist that serve no purpose but to make other species suffer, for example. Think of mosquitoes. Even more difficult to explain in a universe of apparent chaos is the amount of death and nameless lives lost to diseases. How are we to press on when there is no redemption possible to the untold numbers of death that happen every day or the seemingly unending dirge of sorrow that marks the human experience? If I have to choose between no answer to any of this and a point to the universe, I'd rather there be an answer, right? Not only because it gives us a reason to not give up, but it gives us a telos, a goal, some logical reason to take responsibility in our lives. In general, when the debate is framed this way between two incompatible versions of reality, i.e. two claims on the truth, then I want to champion the religious faith perspective. However, it's here that I want to make the distinction between science, the tool, and scientism, the ideology. Right? So science is a systematic, evidence-based method for studying the world through observation and testing. It embraces humility and the revision of scientific theory. Scientism is a dogmatic philosophical belief system that science is the only valid source of knowledge. This would be the same as taking, for example, a power drill, a very useful tool for building a house, and then arguing that all other tools are less important than a drill, and without a drill, all attempts at carpentry would be meaningless or pointless. Thus, scientism, the worldview, and not science, the tool, makes the assumption that only things that are real are physical. Much of the problem, then, for the Christian is one where they feel the need to defend themselves against scientism, which is under the guise of science. Essentially, those who espouse scientism often rope in scientists with their worldview and therefore create the false appearance that all scientists are naturally at odds with those who have religious faith. Does that track? Yeah. So conversely, the Bible offers a different approach to understanding the cosmos. However, part of the problem here is that our language often lacks the specificity to articulate exactly what it is we're trying to say. The scriptures certainly articulate a twofold creation with God's heaven space and human's earthly space. But space here, biblically speaking, does not imply mutual exclusivity. See Epicureanism earlier. Nor does it imply the notion of location or tangibility. No, these two realms or kingdoms are designed to overlap, designed to connect, designed to be made for one another. And humanity has been designed to stand at this threshold between God's space and our earth space. This message is repeated from Genesis on through to Revelation. And the temple is the central point at which heaven and earth meet. Right? So then Messiah Jesus shows up, claiming to be the true temple, providing the ultimate example for humanity of what it looks like for a person to stand at that intersection of heaven and earth. And it's at this intersection that we are able to fulfill our vocations of being truly human. So, I want to argue that the conflict position assumes a false dichotomy. When positioned this way, it creates a straw man of both science and religious faith, which leads us to the next framework, which has an improved understanding of the two. Sorry, back up for me, Hugh. Yeah, so that's physical versus metaphysical. So that's sort of the crux of the debate for conflicts. Yeah, hit me with the next one. So, thanks, bro. So this is contrast, and I need more water. Everybody takes a deep breath. Okay, so next we can champion the contrast position for several reasons. As I kind of mentioned earlier, it seems for most to start from a good-natured attempt for everyone to calm down and just relax for a second, which isn't worth glossing over. You know, agreeableness has its merits. And so Modern society now has found it a bit out of taste to pull a sword on someone you disagree with, but that's not a bad thing, So us getting along with each other, it's got its wins, So, secondly, my favorite essayist, F.W. Boreham, strongmans the contrast position in his essay "Second-Class Citizens" in a book, Mountains in the Mist. Some of his lines here are worth quoting in their entirety. For science and philosophy never find God. They merely find evidence for the existence of a God. It is the offer of a stone to a child crying for bread. Who wants evidence? I want God. Science and philosophy find his footprint on the sand as Robinson Crusoe found the footprint on his island. But who wants a footprint? Would the footprint of his lady satisfy a lover? No. He wants her. I want no footprint. I want him. Oh, that I knew where I might find him. This is the throbbing cry of my hungry soul. I want him, himself. You can never prove the big things of life on which our very existence and happiness depend. No man can prove that his mother loved him. No man can prove that his wife is true to him. Yet no man would wish to linger on after his faith in these things had deserted him. No man can prove that he has been divinely loved and redeemed and forgiven. In short, Boreham argues that scientific work is at risk of atrophying a person's ability to have faith beyond what they can measure. If the scientist is unable to say anything he or she cannot prove without systematic observation, then they are in a difficult position when faced with faith in an unseen God. So whereas the conflict position perhaps most decisively comes to a head at the question of the physical versus the metaphysical, then the conflict was the first, then the contrast position centers around the point of what is provable versus what is faith. Boreham, like Gould from earlier, would argue that scientific analysis, with its many graphs and tests and pipettes, creates a misguided prioritization on what is seeable or measurable. And I agree with that in principle. If the good scientist is required to approach life with a cold, Vulcan-like knowledge that only what is provable can be true, then yeah, I'm better off compartmentalizing these two things in my head. Over here, I'll put scientific discovery and require my choices to be based only on what can be tested. And over here, I'll put religious life and act on faith and trust in the unseen. However, again, I believe this to be a false dichotomy, or at least caricatures what both science and religious faith actually require. Namely, scientific work requires trusting faith. Faith in a rational universe that is governed by laws like gravity or the laws of thermodynamics. Faith in the historical inheritance of knowledge that the scientist wishes to build upon. Faith in the scientific framework they are using or assuming summarizes best the relevant knowledge about a given subject. Faith that truth is even discernible to begin with. And for the psychological scientist, faith that humans have inherent value. None of these things are readily self-evident to the sterile, rigid logic based purely on cause and effect. To find the answers to life's most important questions, it seems we need more than simply the cold calculus of data. Such faith should be quite relevant to any person in training as a counselor or therapist. What you learn in the classroom is a good starting place, but you obviously can't learn every question to ask in every situation. And most importantly, you cannot learn what are the right questions to ask at a given moment. This requires faith in your training. It also requires faith in your gained tacit knowledge. And this tacit knowledge is what the Bible sometimes calls wisdom. More on this later. Secondly, as scientific work requires faith, so should the Christian faith be grounded with a strong conviction for reason, historical evidence, and data. If we did not have logical grounds to believe in the resurrection of Jesus, then our faith should be suspect. Fortunately, one of the inconvenient problems with Christianity, for anyone willing and able to investigate the evidence, is that it holds up to historical experiential scrutiny. As one cherry-picked example, research has shown that those who do not cohabitate before marriage are less likely to get divorced than those who do. Likewise, people who abstain from intercourse before marriage report more enjoyable marriages than those who do not abstain. This clearly doesn't prove Christianity in the legal or even scientific sense, but it is data worth considering. Similarly, there is a recent trend with popular atheists like Jonathan Haidt and Scott Galloway of making secular arguments for Christian norms, such as telling people to attend church regularly. We could also point to the curious case of Louise Perry, a formerly a-religious researcher who now identifies as a Christian agnostic. She stresses the irony of her journey towards faith, articulating it as if she were backed into a corner by the overwhelming amount of evidence. She says, if Christianity is supernaturally true, you would expect it to be sociologically true, and observing quite how sociologically true it is was very persuasive for me. It's from the Honestly podcast. To put it perhaps too bluntly, completely blind faith divorced from any reason, is not faith at all. That is what we call a wish, a baseless hope. Conversely, a faith grounded in reason, yes, opens itself to questions and doubt, but an unwillingness to wrestle with such possibilities says more about the believer's anxiety and fragility, and perhaps even more perniciously about their self-righteous morality, than it says about the strength of their belief or convictions. So again, it seems that science and religious faith cannot be so conveniently sequestered. Scientific work requires faith, and proper faith must be open to questioning and logical conclusions. We need better language to understand how these worlds relate to one another, which leads us to the third position. The convergence position argues that science and religion are not enemies, nor are they merely polite acquaintances. It insists rather that they are brothers. But how so? As I argued earlier, it appears the tipping point of the conflict position hinges on the false dichotomy of the physical versus the metaphysical. And the contrast position, that debate ultimately boils down to what is measurable versus what is faith. As I see it, the crux of the debate for those taking the convergence position centers on meaningless chaos versus meaningful order. How do I mean? Well, as I mentioned above, if we assume that there is nothing more to life than atoms bouncing at random into other atoms, then our behavior and decisions invariably have no lasting purpose. One decision is no more meaningful than the opposite. All of our passions and desires and triumphs and grief will have no lasting impact on the cosmos, regardless of how famous or influential or intelligent or beautiful you are. The author of Ecclesiastes, who stood at the top of the world in wealth, power, and intellect, understood this well. In a word, all of life is then meaningless, without purpose or telos. However, if there is a meaning to life, then it comes naturally that life has a reason to be put into order. It's something worth doing something about. Chaos results from meaninglessness. Order results from purpose. This is crucial to understanding our argument, and it is just as true psychologically as it is philosophically. The brilliant Viktor Frankl, looking around his Holocaust camp, noticed that his fellow prisoners who could not find a purpose to keep living would invariably die. But with his training as a physician, he still managed to help pull rotten teeth or set broken bones. He found some way to put a modicum of order into the chaos he was experiencing. After he survived the war, he would prescribe for his severely depressed patients an occupation, something to sacrifice towards, something worth ascribing meaning to. Those who filled their prescriptions and found work would always fare better than those who did not. The convergence position embraces the notion that scientific realities of thermodynamics and more can be happening at the same time as a meaningful narrative of redemption is being woven within the cosmos. Our faithful guide, John Hott, reasons, the question for cosmic meaning leaves plenty of room for faith and theology in the age of science. And our sense of hope and expectation no more conflicts with science than the meaning of a story conflicts with the grammatical rules that allow it to be told. Now, the Venn diagram, which represents the convergence position, has significant overlap between the two circles. We can go to the next slide. There's significant room for each camp to agree on, and plenty they might each benefit from in sharing knowledge. But I think if we're not careful, we might tacitly assume a mistaken assumption of the contrast position that each is primarily speaking to different aspects of life or creation. If that were true, one should have more authority than the other in speaking to this matter or that matter. Thus, we might find ourselves approaching this conversation with a mentality of what should I avoid rather than what good thing can I pursue. When we approach this framework assuming that most of creation exists in the overlap, we're freed up to aim at a tangible target, which is meaningful order, rather than trying to avoid meaningless chaos. Right? So rather than trying to avoid a mistake, we're reaching for a measurable goal. Such a stance perhaps goes beyond basic complementarianism and argues for healthy interdependence. They are not just learning from one another in mutual respect, but existing at different levels of meaning, which tell two perspectives of the same story, where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So the Venn diagram that, as I see it, that best represents the relationship between religious faith and science is something like this. As you can see, there's almost nothing covered by religious faith that is not also shared by science. And so you may wonder, what are these, exclusionary moons, the little, the bits on the side, what does that pertain to? Well, one example would be that science is not able to ascribe meaning to life, people, and the rest of creation. As a consequence, science alone has no capacity to argue that humans are more intrinsically valuable than animals, for example. Neither can it prove that life is worth living in the first place. All of these matters and more inherently assume a value proposition which science, the tool, simply cannot measure or mathematically validate. These are matters we must take on faith. On the other side, one thing at least that science can do, which religious faith cannot, regards providing levels of specificity and types of methodology. So take as a quick example Proverbs 13:11. Dishonest money dwindles away, but whoever gathers money little by little will increase it. This spiritual probability is true, but lacks the specificity of economic or investment science, right? So these approaches might offer a more strategic plan to enact this proverbial wisdom. Okay, but to refocus on the overlapping majority, the Christian taking the convergence position argues that both science and religious faith complement one another in the pursuit of meaningful order. As the saying goes, all truth is God's truth. The believer need not be afraid of the individual or source of the truth, just so long as it brings chaos into order. Now, wait a minute, you might say. Why would any Christian need science for that? The scriptures and church history and the Holy Spirit are plenty sufficient to tell us how to live. But the argument here is less one that is of dogma and is one more of practicality. Again, if a pop song or a children's poem or a research study or a mathematical formula can point us towards Christ's likeness, then glory to God. If all truth is God's truth, then it must be valuable to use the tools available to us. So, what might it look like to utilize the convergence perspective in our own lives, practically speaking? How might an appreciation of the overlapping nature of science and religious faith impact our behavior and decisions? So this really gets to the heart of the matter. Our current milieu says that science and maybe the unreligiously spiritual might offer some meaning. The American gods of fame, power, fortune, and beauty seem just as popular as ever. But just 10 minutes on any social media network will give you the quick impression that our culture is starving for a satisfying reason to get out of bed in the morning, an answer for how to be truly human. The question it seems we are all asking in some form or fashion is, what is the best way to live? Not all claims to meaning are as legitimate as others because some claims to meaning offer more order than others. So let's assess this salient question through the lens of meaningless chaos versus meaningless order, or meaningful order, So when we speak about meaningless chaos, as it relates to human conduct, we are trying to describe a pattern of behavior which is unproductive, maladaptive, and destructive. Not only does such behavior for the individual lack sustaining purpose in any meaningful sense, it results in a net loss for themselves, society, and the cosmos over time. In my world of psychological diagnostics, We call this chaotic behavior psychopathology. Psychopathology is the fussy word for mental health disorders like depression or trichotillomania. And it literally means, it will be remembered, the study of the suffering of the soul. All psychopathology is on a continuum of severity, which is relative to other pathology. So we would compare one person's anxiety to another person's anxiety to see like which one is worse. And then we might also compare one person's anxiety to schizophrenia. And ultimately, we're trying to see which one has more of an effect, a negative effect on that person and the community at large, right? So the two disorders in clinical psychology which are considered the most destructive are antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. The first and the worst is the disease which is often given to, amongst others, serial killers and rapists. Essentially, a person with this problem is usually so destructive to the community at large that its very hallmark is in the name, antisocial personality disorder. And its close cousin, narcissistic personality disorder, marks individuals whose behavior is defined by corrosive competition with their community. Even behavior which is not remotely a threat to their social standing can be interpreted as an attack that needs to be defeated. You cannot find two mental health problems which offer a worse answer to the question, what is the best way to live? But the alternative, so encouraging, that paragraph, but the alternative, meaningfully ordered behavior, encourages us to use whatever tools available that might show what is the best way to live. And one of the tools or frameworks I find most helpful in that regard is the biopsychosocial spiritual model. In simplest terms, we debated about what to put in the middle here, and then I found the right answer. It was always in front of me. It was Byron. So Lauren hooked me up with an excellent photo this morning. So, okay. So the biopsychosocial spiritual model. So in simplest terms, this framework encourages us to understand a person's experience equally through a biological, psychological, spiritual, and sociocultural lens. This model argues that none of the four have more explanatory power than the other, and each operates less like a perspective or stance and more like a language, using different words to explain the same aspects of the human experience. For example, we could talk about anxiety using the language of the psychological, or a hypervigilant amygdala and limbic system using the language of biology, or a lack of adequate social support, which would be the social, or perhaps a lack of faith or trust, which would be using the language of the religious or spiritual. All of these can be the exact same thing at the exact same time, simply spoken without using different languages. The goal then becomes, for those interested in accurately understanding the human experience, to speak all four of these languages with increasing fluency. So as another example to stress this point, there's a word in German, Schadenfreude, which means to take pleasure from someone else's pain. That would be a German word, right? It's the experience we get when we're driving down the highway and we see a traffic jam going the other way, and we're like, ooh, stinks to be those guys, right? So even though we know what this experience is like here in America, we don't have an English word that really like encapsulates that experience, right? So even if you spoke German and English and you were speaking in English, but you landed upon that experience, you would probably use the word Schadenfreude, right? Because it would more encapsulate what it is you were trying to say. So this is the same with the biopsychosocial spiritual model. When you speak all four of these languages fluently, you're able to freely dance between the four, finding the best vocabulary words to articulate the experience you wish to describe. Not because you couldn't explain it using a different language, or because one of the four had more truth to offer than the other, but because it best articulated the essence of what you were trying to convey. So the crux of my argument then is that none of these languages, or science and religion at large, can fully answer the question of how to live better than the other. This is because both psychology as behavioral science and spiritual formation are both grappling with the same meaningful order and meaningless chaos, but are simply using different vocabulary words. Again, for me, when behavioral science, the tool, is anchored in a Christian worldview, and one's pursuit of spiritual formation is anchored by behavioral science, you are doing the same thing, regardless of the language you're using. True convergence says that they're answering the same questions. This matters, for example, because it's far too easy now to culturally relegate questions to one camp or the other. So, you take the question of right behavior, it's very easy to kind of put that in a category of that's a moral or religious question and miss the reality that our behavior is intended to move people towards meaningful order. Right? 1 Corinthians 14:33, for God is not a God of order, but of peace. These are not simply arbitrary guidelines imposed on others to keep certain individuals in power. They are life to anyone willing to test the hypotheses. You see, the ancients were interested in more transcendent matters than what might individually make us behave in one way or another. No, they were concerned with larger things like chaos and order. And they described the stuff that formed chaos into order as wisdom. This is a useful, practical definition for wisdom, in fact. Wisdom is whatever that puts chaos into order. We see this biblical theme starting all the way back to the first creation narrative in Genesis 1:2. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. In love, God is hovering over this disorder, ready to call forth order, life, and meaning. This was crucial to the Hebrew Scriptures as they saw that God's wisdom set the cosmos in motion and created its order. And it's in the 8th chapter of Proverbs where we find one of its most striking odes. Here, God's wisdom is described as a female who calls from the city gate, offering the good life and guidance on how to be truly human for those who will bother to listen. It was through this wisdom, God's second self, that all things were planned and created. Later, Jewish writers picked up this theme and further developed it, providing a rich context for the early Christian authors who were then reflecting on Jesus' identity. We see this in the poem that breaks forth in Colossians 1, verses 15 and 16 read, "He is the image of God, the invisible one, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things were created in the heavens and here on the earth, things we can see and things we cannot, thrones and lordships and rulers and powers, all were created both through him and for him." The striking similarities between Proverbs 8 and these lines couldn't be less coincidental. Skip ahead to verse 24, where Paul says, "But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God." And again in verse 30, it's because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God. That is righteousness, holiness, and redemption. So when we say that the Bible is a book of wisdom, we are likewise saying that the Bible is a book that is telling us how to be like Jesus, which is to say how to be truly human, i.e., the best way to live. Now again, to repeat the observation that scientific data and religious faith are articulating the same truths, we see Paul in this same book offering a reminder about the old, disordered way the readers used to live. He first makes a short list of essentially the worst sins a person can commit in 3:5. "Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry." He then in 3:8 through 9 adds a second list of the silver medalists for poor human decisions. "But now you must also rid yourself of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Do not lie to each other." Our very own Nathan Chapman summarized in our Colossians series Paul's imperatives about these lists. I meant to make a slide of this, but he basically said the first list of sins, you could summarize that by saying image bearers are not meant to be exploited. And the second list, the silver medalists, now a good summary for that would be image bearers are not meant to be defeated. right? Exploitation and defeat. Does that sound familiar? It's the two mental health disorders you don't want to have. Antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. You would be hard-pressed to find a better crystallization of those problems. What a clinical psychologist would say are the hallmarks of the worst mental health diseases are the exact same behaviors that Paul denounced some 2,000 years ago. When we're talking about becoming wiser in psychology, we call it adaptive behavior or flourishing or higher functioning. And when we're talking about becoming wiser in religious terms, we call it spiritual formation or sanctification. Practically speaking, it's all the same thing. Now, please understand I'm using utilitarian terms. I'm familiar with theology enough to understand that most of what I'm saying needs to be contextualized a great deal in terms of soteriology and pneumatology and theological anthropology to even begin the list. But this talk is already too long, so we can save that for the question and answer period later. But to conclude, thank God, everyone said, by returning to my original question, what is the best way to live? I think the answer to this question is the same as what do we do after we believe in Christ as our risen Savior? Individually speaking, if human beings did not find a satisfying why, then they give up, which results in depression and even death. But not all truth claims are equal, or there would be no truth at all. All answers to life's biggest questions would ultimately have the same results. Psychological science, the tool, helps us to measure which truth claims to the meaning of life offer more order than others. And Christianity has proven itself historically and scientifically to offer the most order, confirming itself as the most meaningful. Does this mean one does not need faith? On the contrary, science demonstrates its own limitations in offering a life worth living without faith. The atheistic approaches to life at best offer meaninglessness, and at worst, unparalleled death and disorder. The warp and woof answer, the one that is most practically salient to the best way to live, is to become wiser. And what are we trying to do when we want to form Christ-likeness in others? Make them wiser. And what is the most salient goal of my job as a psychologist? To help my patients become wiser. Thus, assuming you are a Christian and wondering if psychology or therapy has anything on offer, I would say a resounding yes. Obviously, we need discernment in seeking wise counsel. And there's tons more practical questions to be answered about how to pick the right therapist or how to stay rooted in community so that my therapist isn't the only person who seems to know me, or how do I know if the guidance I'm receiving online or from someone else is accurate. But ultimately, these questions can first be assessed from the standpoint of whether this relationship or this advice or this counsel helps lead my life towards meaningful order or meaningless chaos. An honest answer to that question will do much of the heavy lifting necessary when making these decisions. If religious faith argues for why we should go on a journey and where that journey will lead you, then science offers a compass to help stay the course and signposts about what might lie over the hill if you keep heading in this way or that direction. Can you get there without these tools? 100%. But not paying attention to road signs on a trip isn't a sign of faith. It's looking a gift horse in the mouth. This marks the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your time.